The life of Cassandra Fields, former Attorney General of Louisiana, was thrown into chaos after she was pulled over for no apparent reason. But this wasn't just another routine show of force by police against a black citizen. It marked the beginning of a terrifying scheme when drugs were planted in her car. What they didn't count on was that Cassandra had once written the laws the officers were now trying to twist. More importantly, she had prepared for this. Every detail, every possibility. The question is, can a 63-year-old retired woman take on an entire system that seems untouchable? Comment where you're watching this video and stay until the end to uncover the shocking truth. The May sun stretched across the highway between Monroe and Franklin Parish like it had been poured from a thin layer of golden light, bright but heavy. Cassandra Fields sat behind the wheel of her pearl-colored SUV. The window rolled down just enough to let in the countryside air, thick with the scent of scorched grass and road dust. The late afternoon light leaned softly across her shoulder, casting a glow on her silver hair. Unclear whether it was peace or a warning. On the back seat was a canvas tote, still holding a few lesson plans, printouts from her morning session with high school students about civil rights, about how to use your voice where it counts. The voice of Skylar, an 11th grader, still echoed faintly in her head. "Ms. Cassandra, do laws ever protect us?" Cassandra hadn't answered with a theory. She had only looked at the girl, paused for a moment, then nodded. Because at 63, after over 3 decades in law, after standing before countless committees, after signing off on controversial amendments, Cassandra knew one thing for sure. Justice, if not defended by those willing to stand up for it, is just a vague idea. She stretched slightly, her left hand resting gently on the steering wheel. On the radio, Sam Cooke's voice rose low and soulful. "A change is gonna come." But Cassandra reached over and turned it off. That familiar song, today, didn't calm her like it used to, because the rearview mirror had shown her something that made every nerve in her body tighten. A patrol car, quietly following at a distance that was too consistent, too deliberate. She turned left. The police car turned left. She slowed down. It slowed down too. Silent as a shadow, never breaking a rule, just enough to make Cassandra feel that old sensation, one as familiar as her childhood under Jim Crow, being watched and having no way to prove it. The road back to Franklin Parish wasn't long, but it was full of pauses. Pine woods fading behind her, replaced by soybean fields ripening under the sun. Cassandra thought of dinner. Her daughter was probably finishing up in the kitchen. The grandkids might be fighting to share stories from school. But the car behind her was still there, stuck to her like a shadow. And when the lights finally flashed, whoop, and the siren chirped once, she knew this wasn't going to be just another drive. She didn't panic. She never had. She eased off the gas, signaled right, and pulled into a patch of gravel beside an old gas station, somewhere at least slightly visible from the road. Her car came to a stop. She turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel exactly as protocol demanded, not fast, not slow, and took a long breath. The police car stopped behind her. In the mirror, she saw a familiar figure in a light blue uniform step out. The way he walked, she'd seen it dozens of times in her years in the system, the walk of a man who'd already made up his mind about how this ends. Behind him, a younger officer emerged, tall, thin, his shoulders hesitating as he stepped from the car. Cassandra stared straight ahead. One thought crossed her mind. We're starting here again. One more time. She closed her eyes for a single, short second, then opened them. Everything was still in front of her, and she was still the woman who had never bowed to the system she helped build, because today she carried no badge, but she carried something more valuable: knowledge, courage, and the truth. And like always, she was ready to let it speak. Cassandra kept her eyes on the rearview mirror as the two figures stepped out of the patrol car. The ground beneath her was dry and brittle, her tires having just crushed a layer of red dust speckled with weeds, leaving a curved tire mark, neat, deliberate, unquestionable. Choosing to stop here had been intentional. She had avoided the emptier pull-off ahead and instead parked by an old gas station with a warped metal roof, desolate but within sight of the occasional passerby. A location no one could reasonably use against her in an official report. Clay Hensley walked toward the vehicle with heavy steps, his boots crunching against the gravel with a dry finality. He didn't need to speak. His disdain was already clear in his eyes, the same look Cassandra had seen countless times throughout her career. Silent judgment before anything had even begun. Logan Price followed a few steps behind, standing straight but still tense, his movements cautious, the posture of someone barely 3 months out of the academy. Cassandra rolled down the window just enough to speak, but not enough to invite familiarity. Her voice was even, neutral, not soft, not sharp. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask the reason for this stop?" Clay stood slightly to the left, one hand resting on his belt, not out of habit, but as a quiet show of authority. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, swept quickly across the dashboard, then settled back on her face, as if measuring, labeling, and categorizing. "Nice car. Plates from a different parish," he said slowly, as if that explained everything. Then he raised one eyebrow, a gesture both smug and quietly challenging. Cassandra's face remained still. She didn't frown, didn't smile. Her eyes stayed open just enough, not revealing too much. She knew exactly how vague observations like that made their way into internal reports, especially when they involved people of color. She spoke again, her tone unchanged. "Driving a vehicle registered in another parish is not a violation. This car is legally registered and inspected according to Louisiana state law. If you need documentation, I can provide it right now." Clay smirked, a smile from someone who wasn't listening, because he already believed what he wanted to believe. "I didn't say you were in violation. I said, it looks suspicious. This stretch of road is known for moving hot cargo, and per regulation, I have the right to investigate anything that appears out of the ordinary." From the passenger side, Logan frowned slightly. His eyes flickered as he processed that justification. Something in Clay's wording didn't sit right, even with someone as new as him. Cassandra leaned back slightly in her seat, her hands still on the wheel, not out of retreat, but to reclaim space for herself in this conversation. "Out of the ordinary is the most misused phrase in the history of law enforcement. I respect your authority, officer, but I expect the same respect for my rights as a citizen, rights that do not shrink because of the color of my skin or the price tag on the vehicle I'm driving." Clay inhaled softly. He hadn't expected a response so pointed, and certainly not from an older black woman. He tilted his head, switching tactics. "What do you do for a living, ma'am?" Cassandra didn't respond right away. She weighed the moment and chose the oldest, most effective strategy. Let them reveal themselves. "I teach," she said simply. Clay pressed his lips together, his gaze narrowing. He was analyzing, not to understand, but to probe for weakness. "You're a teacher? There's no need to label the role. I just do what I believe is useful." In that short pause, Cassandra glanced at Logan. The young man stood a few steps back, hands loosely clasped in front of him, eyes shifting between his superior and the woman behind the wheel like someone counting the beats of a chess match without knowing which side to play for. Clay stepped back half a pace, tapped the hood lightly. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Routine check." Cassandra didn't move right away. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes now colder. "I'll comply, but I want to know the specific reason. Is this a random stop, or is it a stop based on racial profiling?" Clay leaned forward, squinting like he'd just heard something that irritated him. "Are you accusing me of being racist?" Cassandra didn't answer. She calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and said quietly, "I don't need to accuse. I'm just counting each step of a procedure I know by heart, and I want to see where that procedure leads this time." With that, Cassandra pushed the burden back onto the system, one she knew better than anyone else who had ever sat behind the wheel on this stretch of road. Clay didn't answer Cassandra's question. He simply looked at her with the kind of visible irritation men often reserve for women who dare to ask the right question at the wrong time, at least from their point of view. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, this time with a voice stripped of any civility, leaving only the cold edge of command. There was no citation of legal provisions, no explanation form for the search, just an order issued from a uniform too used to going unquestioned. Cassandra breathed slowly, not reacting in haste. She glanced at Logan, his eyes still unsure, like he was waiting for someone to reveal the right move in a game no one had taught him how to play. But she knew, in his position, no one could. "I'm not refusing to cooperate, Officer Hensley," she said, gently unbuckling her seatbelt. "But I would like it acknowledged that this search is being conducted without a warrant, without any specific indicators of a violation, and that it will be formally documented from a legal standpoint." Clay didn't respond. He turned his back and walked toward the front of the car, circling to the driver's side as if dodging both her words and her gaze. But that silence was the clearest confirmation of everything Cassandra had just said. She opened the door and stepped out. Her movements weren't fast. Age had given weight to her joints, but that slowness only made her stance more solid. Her low-heeled leather shoes struck the gravel with a sharp, clean sound. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her dark eyes followed Clay's every move without wavering. Logan stood a few steps away, his cap removed and tucked under his arm, an unconscious attempt to distance himself from the performance that was now unfolding. The sunlight struck his forehead, casting light on the growing confusion, not just for Cassandra, but for himself. Clay opened the driver's side door, giving Logan a brief look that said without words, "Don't interfere." Then he bent low and began to rummage through the vehicle. Cassandra didn't move. She stood still, hands placed calmly in front of her stomach, the posture of a woman who had once stood before congressional hearings, silent but powerful enough to make an entire room adjust its tone. "Officer Hensley," she said, her voice still soft but now edged with steel. "Under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, a warrantless search of a vehicle is only legal under specific exceptions, such as immediate threats to safety or clear evidence of criminal conduct. Absent those, this search could be deemed unconstitutional." Clay ignored her, his head still buried inside the vehicle. Logan looked from Cassandra to Clay, as though his eyes were adjusting focus between two flares, one already burning from restrained anger, and the other just moments from turning into a storm. And then, in a blink, it happened. Logan saw Clay pull something small from his chest pocket, a clear, palm-sized plastic bag containing fluffy white powder. His movement was seamless, practiced. His hand slid under the driver's seat and tucked the bag between the leather and the floor. Then he stood up, like he'd just recovered some forgotten item. The entire sequence lasted barely 2 seconds, but for Logan, time stretched into layers of sound crushed into silence. He didn't react, not because he lacked time, but because the shock had swallowed every instinct. Logan's world tilted not because of the white powder, but because of the stark, undeniable truth. His direct supervisor, the man the academy had taught him to trust like family, had just shattered everything he'd been told about ethics, justice, and professional honor. Cassandra hadn't moved, but her eyes locked with Logan's at that exact moment. She didn't know what had just happened, not in detail, but she sensed it. She had seen that look before. The look in the eyes of young people when they realized the system they believed in only worked when you were on the right side of its skin tone. Logan gripped his police cap tightly, the knuckles in his hand turning white. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't reach out to stop what was unfolding. But inside, a war had erupted, unseen by anyone else. A war between trained loyalty and the conscience now screaming inside his chest. Inside the car, Clay straightened up and slammed the driver's door shut. He smoothed his uniform and flashed a crooked smile. "I believe we just found something very interesting." The sound of the car door slamming shut echoed across the open gravel like an invisible gunshot, stretching the air tight and making it tremble, like the surface of a pond struck by a stone. Clay turned around, raising the plastic bag of white powder high in his hand and shouting, his voice hoarse, each word spit out as if he were the one shocked by what he'd just discovered. "We found drugs in the vehicle." The declaration landed like a verdict. No courtroom, no jury needed, just a loud voice, a forceful stance, and a bag of powder that conveniently fit the narrative. Clay's face flushed red, whether from anger or adrenaline was unclear. He turned to Logan, jutted his chin toward the notepad in the rookie's hand. No words were needed. His glare and posture said everything. "Right now." Logan stood there, his hand still holding the notebook, but not a single word had been written. His pen trembled slightly, as if his own hand refused to become an instrument for something his heart could not accept. Part of him wanted to believe there had been a mistake, but the truth was, he had seen it with his own eyes. And from that moment on, every belief he had in procedure, in hierarchy and the honor of the badge, shattered like a mirror struck from within. Cassandra looked at Clay, not smirking, not frowning, just a calm, steady gaze, unnervingly still, the kind that makes others feel exposed, not by emotion, but by truth. "Do you think you're fooling anyone?" she asked, her voice low, each word landing like a stone on the water that had only been pretending to stay still. Clay let out a dry laugh but didn't answer. He turned away again, but barked over his shoulder, as if warning even the air around him. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." The words were meant to corner her, to assert dominance, but they backfired. Cassandra didn't need to shout, didn't need to argue. She simply turned her head and looked straight at Logan, not like a suspect looking at an officer, but like a woman looking at a man standing at a crossroads only he could choose. "I don't need you to protect me," she said, her eyes unwavering. "But if you still want to protect yourself from cowardice, don't let this moment destroy your honor." It wasn't a lecture. It was a blow, striking the noblest part of Logan's being, the part that had once believed that wearing the badge meant becoming a protector, not an accomplice. Logan swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the plastic bag. Words from his graduation ceremony echoed in his mind. The oath they all recited, like a vow, "I swear to uphold the law, justice, and human rights, even if it means standing against those beside me." He never imagined he'd be tested this soon. Behind them, the space was no longer empty. An old pickup had pulled over. A man in a denim shirt stepped out, eyes locked on the scene. A middle-aged woman was filming with her phone. A teenager with a backpack yanked out his earbuds and began live-streaming. "Is that Ms. Cassandra?" someone whispered. Wasn't she the Attorney General? Her name began to ripple through the air like the first gusts of a storm. Clay noticed. He glanced around, his breath quicker now. He hadn't expected anyone to recognize her. He thought she was just another old black woman stranded on a back road. He hadn't calculated for her past to follow her, not like a shadow, but like a fire, burning in reverse, now lighting up his face. Logan stepped back, his eyes still on his notebook, but he hadn't written a word. His fingers began to loosen, as if even his body refused to touch a lie. Cassandra saw this. She didn't press him. She simply stood, still as a moral landmark in the middle of a chaotic scene, not to demand anything, but to remind, even silence is a choice, and every choice has its price. Clay tightened his grip around the handcuffs and moved toward Cassandra with firm, deliberate steps, as if the only thing missing from today was the metallic click of steel closing around someone's wrists. In the fade-in afternoon light, his shadow stretched across the dusty ground, merging with Cassandra's. But even overlapped, it couldn't hide the stark difference between the two. Cassandra stood tall, her hands calmly placed in front of her, eyes fixed on him, not wavering, not resisting. It was the gaze of someone who had walked into dozens of meeting rooms where doubt filled the air, but never once bowed her head. As Clay yanked her wrist upward with more force than necessary, Cassandra spoke, her voice steady, every word landing like a declaration long rehearsed. "On what grounds am I being arrested, Officer Hensley?" The question wasn't a demand for rights, it was a test, and Clay knew it. He growled, "I'm following proper procedure. We just found drugs in your vehicle. Recording it in the report is the next step." He turned his head and threw a quick, sharp glance at Logan, a look like a blade, reminding him that any hesitation could be read as insubordination. "Write it down. Time, location, evidence, everything. Do it now." Logan held his notepad, his fingers brushing the pen, but they still hovered at the edge of the page, as if each word he might write weighed 10 times more than it should. In his ears, Clay's voice blared like a distorted siren under pressure, and in front of him, Cassandra, her wrist raised, her face unshaken, stood like a monument no force could topple. Across the road, a small crowd had started to form. A man in a baseball cap turned to the person beside him and said something before both lifted their phones to record. A woman behind the gas station had put her phone on speaker, her voice echoing across the lot. "What's going on over there? Someone record and send it to me." Cassandra didn't turn her head, but she felt it, the shift in the air. The isolation was thinning as more eyes turned to witness, and she knew this was the moment to turn observation into pressure. "You're all seeing what's happening here," she said aloud, not shouting, but loud enough to carry across the open space. "An elderly woman is being handcuffed for owning a car that someone decided didn't fit her profile. No legal explanation, no warrant, no proper procedure. But one thing is very clear: prejudice." Clay hissed through his teeth, "Don't incite the crowd. I'm only saying what they've already seen," Cassandra replied, still not turning, her voice sharper now. "And I'm doing it while my hands are being held." His jaw clenched. He turned back to Logan. "What are you waiting for? Write." Logan didn't respond, but sweat had formed along his hairline. The blank page beneath his hand no longer felt like a place to record facts. It had become the surface of a decision that could never be undone. Everything Clay was demanding could be made to look legitimate on paper. The report could be signed. The evidence was photographed. The case was filed away as a successful arrest. But then his eyes fell to Cassandra's hand, the one that had signed off on so many legal documents, the one that had approved amendments this very system was now twisting to turn against her. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't telling him what to do. Her presence alone was enough to tear his conscience apart. Across the street, a teenage boy raised his phone, live streaming the entire scene. Comments flooded the screen like a river. What's going on here? Is she guilty, or is this staged? Cops are just doing their job. Stop blaming them. If she's cuffed, there must be a reason. But through the noise, the boy's voice rose above the rest, clear, direct, unwavering. That's Ms. Cassandra Fields. Everyone in Franklin Parish knows her. She teaches law for free every week. She's the kindest woman in this whole area. I swear she'd never touch the stuff the cops are accusing her of. Clay spun around, panic flashing in his eyes. He barked at the kid. "Turn that live stream off. Anyone recording will be arrested for obstruction." But the bark had lost its bite. An older woman near the gas station gate crossed her arms and shot back. "You're already being recorded. And what kind of investigation has no paperwork? You think we're stupid?" Cassandra stayed silent. She didn't need to intervene. She knew her power now didn't lie in shouting back, but in standing there, visible, in showing everyone that a black woman, falsely accused, was still standing. No tears, no retreat, no surrender to the role of victim in a story that was hers to own. The space no longer resembled a routine traffic stop. The people who had originally paused out of curiosity were now forming an unspoken circle, standing shoulder to shoulder, surrounding a patch of dusty ground. In the heavy silence stretched across the crowd, no one shouted, no one rushed forward, but their eyes, every one, held enough weight to make even the most command-hardened authority falter. Clay still gripped the handcuffs tightly, trying to maintain control. He moved toward Cassandra as if he still held some power, as if one last word might turn the tide. But before he could close the distance, he was stopped abruptly. Logan had stepped forward faster than even he expected. He stood between Clay and Cassandra, his shoulders tight with tension, but his gaze no longer avoiding. For a split second, time froze. Clay glared at his subordinate, voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Logan swallowed hard, then spoke. Though his voice trembled, every word came out clear, like a handwritten indictment authored by conscience itself. I saw him plant the bag. He put it in the car." The words at first dropped like a single wrong note in a silent orchestra, but the crowd instantly stiffened. A few people exhaled audibly. Some exchanged stunned glances. Then the silence swelled into a wave of righteous, rising outrage. Clay froze, as if drained of all energy. His eyes widened, locked onto Logan like he didn't recognize him anymore. But a breath later, he exploded, his face flushed red as he roared, "You just ruined your career, kid!" The shout, meant to intimidate, only sounded like a confession. The crowd began to murmur, then speak. Voices layer into a chorus of disbelief. "He's threatening a witness? He's lost all shame? Now threatening his partner? Why isn't he in cuffs yet?" Each comment, though not yelled, hit Clay like open-handed slaps, not with fists, but with truths he could no longer dodge. His face burned, not from power being challenged, but from the raw humiliation of a performance torn apart under dozens of watchful eyes. Just then, the whine of an approaching siren cut through the noise. A second patrol car skidded into the roadside, brakes kicking up a fine mist of dust. A door opened, and out stepped a woman with a firm stance, crisp uniform, and the kind of gaze forged from years of dealing with the unacceptable. It was Lieutenant Marlene Keaton, the officer known in the region as the People's Cop, one who never let wrongdoing slide, whether it came from citizens or within the ranks. Keaton didn't rush. She surveyed the scene like mapping out a battlefield. Her eyes landed on Cassandra, still standing, wrist held, but head unbowed. Then, to Logan, her gaze softened slightly at the sight of him standing between a superior and justice. Finally, she turned to Clay, and that look sliced like a razor across steel, sharp, cold, and without compromise. "Everyone stood down," she said, not loudly, but with enough command to drop the noise of the crowd into silence. "Officer Hensley, step back, right now." Clay opened his mouth to argue, but Keaton's eyes forced the words back down. He stepped back once, then half a step more, his face rigid, but his eyes now flickering. Keaton moved forward, signaling to the two officers who had arrived with her. "Secure the scene. Log the exact positions of everyone present. Call internal affairs, and separate these two officers from the subject immediately." Her voice rang like a bell of reckoning. Someone in the crowd murmured, "Finally, someone doing their damn job." Another let out a short, bitter laugh. "Let's see who gets exposed on camera." Clay looked around, his every facial twitch reflecting confusion and disgrace. He had believed he could control this narrative, just like countless times before. But now, he had become the central character in a live stream watched by thousands. His name tied to one of the most disgraceful acts a cop could commit. Cassandra had said nothing since. She only looked at Logan, the young officer now being helped up by a member of the public, as if in gratitude. Her gaze held no pride nor pity, just a quiet nod, deep enough to say what words couldn't. You crossed the line and you chose the right side. And as for Clay, he no longer had a place to stand. The crowd's anger was no longer loud. It had condensed into a silent, steady pressure, the kind that makes it impossible to move when you're surrounded not by hands but by eyes. As two new officers approached to remove Clay from the scene and Logan was guided to a separate area to give his statement, Cassandra remained still beside her SUV. The late afternoon breeze stirred the hem of her white shirt, dust clinging to the cuffs of her pants. In the temporary calm after the storm, one truth rang louder than any of the shouts that had come before. They had never been afraid. From the moment she saw the patrol car appear behind her on that desolate stretch of road, Cassandra had understood this wasn't just another routine stop, something every person of color in America is all too familiar with. She had lived long enough to tell the difference between suspicion shaped on training and bias nurtured by design. And that car, the way it kept a careful distance, the way it didn't flash its lights right away, the way it waited for the most isolated moment to make its move, said only one thing. This was planned, not a chance. But no one in the crowd knew that. Not Logan, not even Clay, the man who carried out the setup, had any idea that the woman he thought he could take down with a cheap trick had known everything from the first second. The glasses she wore, assumed to be for aging eyes, actually housed a tiny microphone, activated by a switch near her right ear. Beneath the floor mat of the driver's seat was a discreet recording unit linked to a dash cam tucked neatly into the rearview mirror. The entire system synced with her phone, ready to upload to a secure cloud in case of emergency. Cassandra had prepared it all because in a system designed to doubt people like her, the truth couldn't live on testimony alone. It had to be stored. It needed more than one anchor. And above all, she never put her life or her dignity in someone else's hands. Not because she didn't trust Logan to do the right thing, but because she understood that truth should never depend on the courage of a young man caught between loyalty and conscience. She knew people didn't always betray out of malice. Sometimes they did it out of fear, and she could not let her fate be decided by someone else's fear. That's why Cassandra had prepared like a soldier walking into enemy territory, quietly, carefully, leaving no weakness exposed. Not paranoia, awareness, honed by a lifetime in the system, knowing exactly where it could break, especially when it faced a black woman who dared to say, "I will not be silent." And, indeed, she hadn't been. Just days before the stop, Cassandra had spoken at a closed-door budget hearing at the Louisiana State House. As an independent legal advisor, she had strongly opposed a new budget proposal, one that dressed itself in numbers but funneled more funds to police militarization while slashing oversight programs, especially in black-majority districts. She had stood without a script, relying only on memory and conviction, and exposed the inconsistencies in funding, the loopholes that allowed departments under investigation to receive new gear without new accountability. She cited data on precincts with high complaint rates receiving financial bonuses, and she ended with a sentence that froze the entire room. Empowering the armed while weakening the watchful is the seed of abuse. History has warned us too many times. No one rose to counter her words, but just days later, A leaked email from within the police department landed in a former colleague's inbox. Attached were stats on problematic figures obstructing budget approval, and one bolded line stood out. These old black folks think they're smarter than the system. Time to teach them a lesson. When Cassandra read those words, she didn't rage. She printed the email, stamped it with the date and time, and filed it among old case documents at home. Not to retaliate right away, but in case someone decided to play dirty. And today, at the exact moment Clay slammed her car door and shouted, "We found drugs!" she knew the game had begun. When Lieutenant Keaton ordered her hands released and invited her into a separate vehicle to give her statement, Cassandra simply nodded. She stepped inside, closed the door, and calmly pulled out her phone. A few taps on a preset app, and within seconds, all footage and audio from the car's internal systems were uploaded to her private cloud, with copies sent to 3 people: her attorney, a friend in the Office of Internal Affairs, and a civil rights law professor she used to teach alongside. Outside, Clay sat on the patrol vehicle's step, sweat trailing down his temples, his eyes vacant. He had no idea the recordings held every detail he never expected. His voice, cold and commanding as he forced Cassandra from the vehicle, his calculated silence in response to legal questions, and most damning of all, the exact moment he leaned into the driver's seat, just as the plastic bag left his hand. Logan, now sitting in a different patrol car a few meters away, also didn't know everything had been captured. But the way he looked at Cassandra as she exited the vehicle, relieved and burdened at once, showed he sensed she had never been just another victim in this setup. The crowd remained. Though the shouts had faded, their focus hadn't. Eyes still followed every movement of the officers, every figure entering the scene, every phone lifted to record. A middle-aged man asked aloud, "Who is she to stand that calm?" A young woman replied, "I don't know everything, but I've seen her teach kids at the church. She helps people without asking for anything back. Who's gonna help her now?" The question fell into the quiet between waves of emotion. Then, like the first whisper of a storm still forming, someone said, "We can't let this get buried." Cassandra knew this battle wasn't over. She had the evidence, the lawyer, and the allies. But she also knew the system, like always, would not fall easily to a black woman who dared to challenge it. She was entering the most dangerous phase, the moment the truth surfaces, but those in power have not yet fallen. 3 days after the incident, a yellow envelope stamped with urgent was delivered to Clay Hensley, notifying him of his temporary suspension. Though it was only the first step in a formal investigation, for someone like him, it felt like public humiliation. Clay couldn't hide his fury. He walked out of the precinct with heavy steps, his head held high, like a man trying to play the final scene of a tragic hero betrayed. Only everyone watching already knew who the real villain was. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. On his way to the parking lot, he stopped by Logan's patrol car, where the young officer sat quietly after his internal review. Clay leaned on the window, his face close to the barely cracked glass, and hissed through clenched teeth. Not loud, but with the venom of a curse. "You think they'll call you a hero? Wrong. You're just a kid who couldn't keep his mouth shut. Everything from now on will be harder than anything in your training manual." He didn't wait for a response, but his words lingered, like smoke smoldering after the wind dies. Less than a week later, Logan received a summons from the Internal Ethics Committee. The sender was the central office in Baton Rouge. The subject line was neat and clinical: request for testimony regarding violation of reporting procedures and disclosure of unverified information to the public. The letter wasn't an indictment, but it carried all the weight of a threat, a legal trap, a message loud and clear. You said what you shouldn't have, and now you'll be judged by the very people you once called your team. Logan read the letter 3 times. Every word felt like a nail driven slowly into a mind trying to stay upright. He wasn't shocked, but knowing exactly how the system he once admired worked didn't make it any less bitter. Cassandra knew before Logan even had a chance to call her. Marlene Keaton was the first to deliver the news. She arrived at Cassandra's home early Thursday morning with a folder fresh from headquarters. In a crisp uniform, hair pinned up tight, she got straight to the point. "They're pulling Logan in. I've seen this before. No weapons needed, just a few printed memos and a door labeled committee, and they'll crush a man's conscience." Cassandra took the folder, but didn't open it right away. She stepped onto the front porch, where morning light spilled across the old wooden bench she sat on each day. Her hand brushed the railing, her eyes fixed on the garden, not to admire it, but to line up the thoughts clicking into place. She wasn't surprised. A woman who had walked the system from defense attorney to prosecutor to attorney general knew all too well. Justice is bent not only by violence but by memos, by procedures, by accusations dressed in legal syntax. She needed no advice. When she turned back, she asked only one question. "When is his hearing?" 3 days, Marlene replied. "They'll pretend it's just a routine review, but I know this script. It's how they silence anyone thinking of speaking up." Cassandra nodded. The wind moved through her hair, steady and deliberate, just like how she'd walked into that budget hearing weeks ago, not to win approval, but to speak, whether they listened or not. That afternoon, she called a longtime civil rights attorney she'd worked with at the federal office in New Orleans, then a law professor specializing in whistleblower protections. Within 12 hours, she had prepared 3 preliminary legal briefs to support Logan, along with a formal petition to the State Justice Oversight Committee demanding the presence of an independent observer at Logan's hearing, because Cassandra knew retaliation in the name of justice is the most insidious form of violence. It doesn't kick down doors at night. It sends letters. It doesn't shout in the streets. It taps on dignity, forcing a person to choose between silence and truth. And because of that, it had to be exposed with weapons of equal force, law and light. In the meantime, Logan continued his shifts with a new caution. The morning handshakes stopped. No one used his name. In the locker room, someone had moved his uniform to a different stall. No one admitted doing it. On the patrol car's rearview mirror, someone left a scribbled sticky note. "Barking dogs don't change anything." Logan didn't remove it, not to accept it, but to remind himself. If they had to resort to this, it meant his words had shaken someone. Cassandra met with Logan the day before his hearing. They sat on a stone bench in front of the old community library, where she'd once taught her first legal literacy class to young black graduates. She didn't ask if he was afraid. She already knew the answer. Instead, she said, "They'll use every trick to make you quiet. But if you still speak, not for me, but for yourself, they won't know what to do next. Because there's no protocol for someone who's not afraid to lose what the system thinks is a reward." Logan looked at her, not as a rookie looking to his mentor, but as a man fully aware of what stood ahead and willing to face it. Tomorrow, he would walk into a room designed to make him feel small. But he would carry with him more than a legal brief. He would carry a truth growing louder in every pair of eyes watching. And to Cassandra, that was the first sign the fight had entered a new phase, one where those in power no longer held all the control. Logan was cleared during the hearing. The Ethics Committee concluded that he had acted within the principles of internal whistleblowing and found no evidence of unauthorized disclosure to the public. But within the uniformed world, that truth did nothing to ease the air. If anything, it chilled it further, like a cold wind slipping through locker vents and settling between people, turning the entire precinct into a pressure chamber where even a small nudge could cause an explosion. The next morning, Logan walked down the hall of the department under the gaze of those who used to greet him with handshakes. Now, their looks sliced through him like invisible blades. No one said a word out loud, but body language had never spoken so clearly. A former colleague went silent mid-sentence when Logan entered a room. Another shoved a door open hard enough for it to hit Logan's shoulder, then walked off as if nothing happened. His locker had been pried open. Inside, a crumpled family photo lay among wet tissue paper, and his pens were tossed aside like trash. No notes, no explanation, just the twisted smiles of those nearby and unspoken dare. Try speaking up again. As for Cassandra, the retaliation wasn't even subtle anymore. One morning, she opened her front door to find shards of glass scattered across the porch. The living room window had been smashed during the night. No witnesses, but neighbors heard an engine rev and speed away. On the floor lay a folded piece of paper, scrawled in bright red ink. "You think you're smarter than us?" She read the note, sat in her wooden chair where morning light now pierced the cracked glass, and didn't dwell on fear but on how darkness always tries to stomp out what light remains. She had seen this kind of revenge before, not just in law books, but in life, where the guilty often wear the mask of order. But never had it come this close, and that proximity only sharpened her clarity. Winning a hearing was only the beginning. What she now faced was far more dangerous. The fury of those who knew their cover was slipping. Her daughter wasn't spared either. A deep scratch ran down the side of her car. That same morning, walking her child to school, she noticed unfamiliar boot prints on the doormat. The home's security camera, normally flawless, had stopped recording precisely during the night. Cassandra didn't ask her daughter if she was scared. She already knew. Instead, she held her tight and whispered, "We didn't build this world, but we're teaching our daughters how not to be swallowed by it." The community session that Saturday went ahead as usual. Cassandra arrived earlier than usual, carrying printed excerpts from the law. This time, not about civil rights broadly, but specifically about recording rights, the right to refuse a search, and the duty to speak up when witnessing misconduct. Beneath the old fluorescent lights of the church hall, she spoke each article clearly, as if striking a drumbeat on the foreheads of those who once thought they could silence her. And to the teens sitting before her, many of whom had never imagined being pulled over just because of their ski, Cassandra was no victim. She was living proof that some people still choose to stand straight, even as the world around them bends. Logan sat in the back of the room. He hadn't been invited. He came because he needed to hear that voice again, the voice that had steadied him through sleepless nights filled with thoughts of giving up. He was still on the force, but every shift now felt like a minefield. Once, he noticed his radio frequency had been changed. Another time, his patrol schedule was printed incorrectly, causing him to miss a shift and receive a formal reprimand. They didn't take him down openly. They came in slices, slow, quiet cuts meant to turn him into a ghost in his skin. That night, he waited outside the church hall. When Cassandra stepped out, streetlights cast golden shadows across the trees. He asked one question, barely above a whisper. "If we keep going like this, will it ever end?" Cassandra paused, looking up at the sky, clear of clouds but not yet full of stars. She answered slowly, "It won't end if good people believe standing up is only temporary. But if we live as a way of being, then every small act is another stone laid on the road to a different America." It was already dark when Cassandra left the community center in Baton Rouge. The workshop had gone more smoothly than she expected. Over 100 attendees, most of them young people and elders from the area. They hadn't come out of curiosity, but because they wanted to hear from her, the woman who dared to step into the deepest waters of the system, where the light of the law usually arrived last. She didn't linger. After thanking a few organizers, Cassandra grabbed her bag and walked through the rear lot toward her car. The streetlight had been out since the previous week, and the maintenance team was still waiting on budget approval. Her steps weren't hurried, but they were cautious. She once believed caution was for litigators. Now she knew. It was survival for those who speak the truth others want buried. With less than 10 meters to go, she sensed something behind her. Not clear footsteps, but a subtle shift in the rhythm of the air. Cassandra stopped. Her eyes scanned the shadows near her car. One shadow appeared, then two, then three. No time to reach her phone, no chance to turn around. A rough hand clamped onto her arm with the force of someone fluent in violence. Another figure came from behind, gagging her with a coarse cloth. A voice whispered, cold as a blade, "You should have kept your mouth shut." The words weren't a threat anymore. They were a sentence delivered by those who believed the law belonged to a certain kind of person, and anyone demanding justice deserved to be silenced. Cassandra struggled, but her body no longer moved like it once had in lecture halls or courtrooms. Two of the men dragged her toward the end of the lot, where a black pickup, no plates, sat waiting. One yanked her by the hair, leaned in close to study the face of the woman who dared poke the hive. "Want to be a hero? Let's see how loud you scream now." Before he could finish, another voice cut through the dark, colder, clearer. "Let her go. Right now." The click of a slide racked back on a Glock echoed through the night. All three men froze. Standing a few yards away, Logan Price held his pistol steady, aimed squarely at the nearest attacker's chest. His hands didn't shake, his eyes didn't blink, and his voice, it wasn't the voice of a rookie once barked at on the training field. It was the voice of a man who knew what was worth protecting and what he was willing to fight for. One of the men flinched, daring to test the odds. He barely twitched his shoulder before a shot cracked the air. The bullet missed, but it sliced through the space inches from his hand. They froze again. Cassandra leaned against her car, eyes locked on Logan, trying to stay conscious. He didn't rush forward. Still holding his weapon, Logan gave a crisp order. "Hands on your head. Face the wall. One more step, and I fire." One man tried to bolt. Logan fired a second round. It hit the dirt just in front of the runner's foot. The man slipped and crashed to the ground. Another released Cassandra, raising his hands, lips sealed tight. The third shook like a leaf in a storm, head bowed, muttering, We were just following orders." Logan didn't move. His eyes stayed on the one who spoke. He keyed his radio, called for backup, and requested medics. Meanwhile, the dash cam system in his cruiser, top of the line, had recorded everything. The voices, the hands, the night. Every breath the attackers took, every threat they spat, stamped into a digital record this country could not ignore. 15 minutes later, the parking lot lit up with red and blue. The three men were cuffed and removed. Cassandra, still conscious, was lifted onto a stretcher. When Logan moved to her side, she reached out, not to thank him, but to keep him grounded. "I knew they'd come," she whispered through shallow breaths. "I just didn't think it'd be in the middle of a city like Baton Rouge." Logan squeezed her hand, anger simmering behind his eyes. They think the law only works when it's on their side, but this time they picked the wrong people. By morning, the footage from Logan's dash cam had gone viral, spreading like dry grass touched by flame. There was no more debate, no more opposing narratives. The images were clear. Three men ambushing a 63-year-old woman in the dark, restraining her, dragging her toward a vehicle, only to be stopped by a young officer, gun raised, voice steady. The community erupted. Civil rights groups issued joint statements. The press called it a failed ambush and a victory of courage. But for Cassandra, the part she remembered most wasn't the danger. It was the moment Logan's headlights lit up the faces of men who believed they could hide in the dark. and she knew that light didn't come from a headlamp. It came from a man who had once stood at the edge of cowardice and chose to step beyond it. 24 hours after the failed ambush, the footage from Logan's dash cam had been shared millions of times across platforms. But unlike past incidents that faded into silence or were distorted by mainstream narratives, this time people couldn't look away because of the image: an unarmed elderly woman being assaulted by 3 men in a dark parking lot, and a young officer standing between them, gun raised, like a vow to defend the truth, not the system. What followed was no longer in the hands of any official agency. People who had once stayed silent began to speak. Protests erupted in Baton Rouge, spread to New Orleans, then spilled over to Jackson, Birmingham, and Atlanta. Crowds filled the streets, raising hand-painted signs: "Justice doesn't retire. Unmask the system." Facing a wave of public outrage that couldn't be subdued by half-hearted statements, the Louisiana State Police were forced to launch a broader investigation, not just into Clay Hensley's conduct, but into what stood behind him. When the case files landed on Lieutenant Marlene Keaton's desk, she didn't hesitate. She assembled an independent task force from 3 neighboring regions and ordered a full review of every report involving Clay from the past decade. What they found wasn't a crack. It was a collapsing tunnel beneath the institution. Missing files. Cameras accidentally disabled during shifts, with complaints. Incident numbers were altered on handwritten reports. Victim statements rescheduled and rewritten. And disturbingly, a pattern of arrests targeting Black individuals without warrants, justified by vague terms like suspicious behavior or refusal to cooperate. The name "The Guardians" began appearing in internal memos, email threads, and even in the personal log of a young officer who had requested a transfer. The group didn't wear distinct uniforms or display any public insignia, but they recognized each other by a small silver pin shaped like a hawk, often hidden beneath body armor or stored in personal lockers. They weren't isolated to one precinct. They operated quietly across parishes, bound by an unspoken ideology: preserve order from being disrupted by victimhood. And the order they protected was nothing more than power kept in the hands of those who looked like them: white, conservative, hostile to oversight, and resentful of voices like Cassandra's. The missing camera data from the night Clay planted drugs on Cassandra was now confirmed to have been tampered with. Internal warning emails were sent after her private budget hearing showed traces of forwarded messages identifying her as a priority individual in need of attitude adjustment. And the local leader of the Guardians in Franklin Parish? None other than Clay Hensley. Cassandra's vocal opposition to the budget proposal, where police weaponization increased year after year while community oversight was gutted, had marked her as a threat. She hadn't just questioned spending. She'd questioned the foundation that protected those hiding behind numbers. And like all systems built on rot, their response wasn't dialogue. It was suppression. The drug setup, Logan's summons, the Baton Rouge assault, now redrawn as links in a chain of deliberate strategy. Those once dismissed as rogue actors were now revealed as gears in a machine operating through legal loopholes and communal fear. Under growing pressure, state officials could no longer remain silent. An emergency session was convened with representatives from the Department of Justice. The investigation was elevated to a full-scale inquiry titled "Systemic Abuse of Power Motivated by Racial Bias," a phrase last used in the landmark Rodney Thomas case 3 decades ago, rarely invoked since. Cassandra didn't leave her town. Despite invitations from civil rights organizations offering respite in other states, she continued holding community sessions. Now, not just about rights, but about the architecture of a system that, if never challenged, will consume the very law it claims to uphold. The evening after the preliminary report was released, A group of university students in Louisiana held a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps. A wooden sign stood at the front, the letters rough but heavy with meaning. Justice doesn't need guns. It needs people who don't run. Logan, once the rookie, was now living proof of that. He received letters from families who'd once been framed but never vindicated, from mothers who lost children to false charges, from children asking for the first time about their rights in a world still filled with shadows. But because of that, Logan had also become the most scrutinized man in the department. People took photos of his car. He was followed home. His patrol schedule was mysteriously shifted, and one morning, he found a small cardboard box at his doorstep. Inside was a single live bullet and a printed note. There won't be a second chance. Instead of retreating, he brought the box to Lieutenant Keaton, and instead of hiding, he submitted an application to officially join the state's Special Internal Investigation Unit. "Because I've seen it from both sides," he told Keaton, "and I want to start cleaning from the inside." Before the sun had even risen over the Louisiana horizon, Cassandra was already seated at the small wooden desk by the window, the same desk she had used for 10 years to write legal lessons for her community. But today, the words she wrote were no longer meant for a small classroom. They were for an entire generation that had never truly been protected beneath the American flag. On the first page, she wrote, "The Fields Act, a framework for truth and trust." Her name, Cassandra Fields, wasn't there for praise but as a declaration. A black woman, once framed, nearly silenced by violence, now rewriting the law, with the same hands that once trembled in the dark but never dropped the pen. Alongside her was a team of civil rights lawyers, activists, and former prosecutors who had left the system out of disgust. Some came from Atlanta, others from Minneapolis, and many had marched after the death of George Floyd. But what united them was the belief that if the system wouldn't fix itself, then those it tried to crush would be the ones to rewrite it. The Fields Act wasn't a plea written in passion. It was the product of 3 months of nonstop work, days drafting, nights reviewing, cross-checking every clause against federal, state, and municipal codes. Every line was crafted to be airtight. Every article born from experience. The conveniently broken cameras, the ignored reports, the truth-tellers turned into traitors. The act demanded 4 mandatory pillars. First, independent, state-level oversight for all police departments. No more internal warnings. No more investigating ourselves. A council of attorneys, civilians, and outside experts would evaluate every complaint. Second, 100% functional body cams for every shift. No exceptions. No technical errors. Footage stored externally, made public after every arrest. Third, full legal protection for whistleblowers. Any officer reporting misconduct would have guaranteed anonymity, job security, and legal shield. No demotions, no forced transfers, no internal exile. Fourth, transparent traffic stop and arrest data. The numbers could no longer stay buried. Monthly updates would be accessible to the public, showing racial breakdowns, stop reasons, timing, and outcomes. Cassandra had no illusions about the resistance this law would face. She had lived long enough to know, in places where justice has been strangled, people aren't afraid of the truth. They're afraid of the truth being written into law. And, as she predicted, the first hearings unfolded like storms over the bayou. A white state senator, a former police chief, slammed his hand on the table and barked, "This isn't reform. This is an insult to the thousands of officers keeping our streets safe." Across from him, supporters held up photos of loved ones lost in unexplained arrests. A black mother, eyes rimmed with tears, took the stand and held up a picture of her 17-year-old son. He just forgot to signal. No record, no charges, but he never came home. Public opinion fractured sharply. The media called it America's New Constitutional Reckoning. Far-right groups labeled the Fields Act an attack meant to weaken police. Civil rights organizations called it a turning point. America finally confronting itself. To Cassandra, every debate was worth hearing, as long as it wasn't driven by fear of losing privilege. In a closed-door session at the state capitol, she stood between rows of uneasy lawmakers and said, "I didn't write this law to go after police. I wrote it to protect good officers from being swallowed by the shadows of those who abuse their badge. And to give people like me the right to believe that when we're pulled over, we don't have to hit record just to stay alive." Her words sliced through the gloss of politics. Some fell silent, others looked away. But one thing Cassandra knew for certain: no one could pretend not to know anymore. At the same time, Logan was invited to testify as a witness. He wore a plain gray suit, his hair trimmed, his expression clear and unwavering. When asked why he supported the Fields Act, he said simply, "Because if this law had existed a year ago, I probably wouldn't have had to draw my weapon alone to save a woman who once served as Attorney General." When asked whether he feared for his career, Logan smiled. "I think we should start worrying about the reputation of a system where silence used to be considered professional." The Fields Act had not yet passed, but it had already laid the foundation for something irreversible. When laws are written from wounds, they are no longer just tools. They become testimonies no one can deny. The courtroom was lit by a neutral light, not golden like hope, nor gray like despair, but a stark, bare clarity, as if every corner of the room was being forced into visibility. In the front row, Cassandra sat upright, hands resting on her knees, eyes fixed on the witness stand where fragments of truth awaited assembly into a complete verdict. Clay Hensley stood on the opposite side. His face no longer wore the smirk that once clung to him. He had been silent since entering, not a curl of the lip, not a sideways glance. But this silence wasn't remorse. It was calculation, the quiet of a cornered animal still weighing its final lunge. The prosecutor began with a concise string of evidence, short but tight, pulling every eye to the center of the case. First came the civilian video, the same clip that had ignited public outrage, played before the court with one line of narration. This is the moment an unarmed citizen was accused of carrying narcotics by an officer sworn to uphold the law. Then came the audio from Cassandra's glasses, not only crystal clear but saturated with the tones of abused authority. Clay's sharp, agitated breathing as he issued threats. Cassandra's calm, steady voice asking for legal justification. The courtroom didn't stir, but the silence felt like a frozen lake. One touch and everything beneath would crack. Then came Logan Price, the young officer who had chosen truth over safety. He recounted every detail. The flicker of suspicion in Clay's eyes, the subtle movement of a hand sliding something beneath Cassandra's seat, the exhale of relief when Clay stepped back like a man finishing a ritual he'd performed many times before. Clay's defense tried to shift the narrative, pointing to occupational stress, the pressures of the job, and even citing an old psychological evaluation. But those arguments only served to sharpen the core truth. This wasn't a slip. It was the behavior of a system long unchallenged. During closing statements, the prosecutor delivered one line before handing the case to the jury. "We are faced with a critical question. If someone like Cassandra Fields can be framed, who among us is truly safe?" After 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Clay Hensley was found guilty on all counts: evidence tampering, abuse of power, intentional assault, witness intimidation, and gross misconduct in public office. There was no applause when the sentence was read, just a long, collective exhale, not from satisfaction, but as if a weight had finally been released after years of being held in the lungs. Clay was escorted out in cuffs, his head held high. But his gaze, once used to intimidate, was now just a fogged mirror reflecting a system beginning to fracture. For those who believed themselves above the law, the harshest punishment wasn't the sentence. It was being seen, fully and without distortion. But the story didn't end there. In the wake of the expanded investigation, more members of the Guardians were identified and charged. One had tampered with the internal video system, another had forged signatures in traffic stop reports, and a mid-ranking officer fled the state after being accused of erasing internal complaints. Every name revealed another chain of misconduct, like Cassandra had reached into a wall and uncovered a nest long rotted from the inside. While the media hailed the trial as a landmark case, Cassandra didn't see it as a finish line. She knew one courtroom victory could never dismantle the web of injustice woven into the very framework of enforcement. So, at the press conference following the trial, she took the podium, not with tears but with a voice measured and resolute. Today, the court did its job, but to protect justice in the long term, we cannot rely on verdicts alone. We need a law. We need a structure that prevents what happened to me from happening again. That's why the Fields Act must be passed. She said it before a row of microphones, in front of reporters who had once framed the story as political drama, and before skeptics who thought she was just trying to make noise. But in Cassandra's eyes that day, there was no need for validation, only clarity, like a spotlight shining into the last corners of a system long shielded by silence. The April wind in Baton Rouge carried the thick, sticky heat of the American South, but inside the political corridors of the state capitol, there was a different kind of heaviness. One not born of weather, but of a silent tug-of-war between the old world clutching power and the new one demanding to be born. The Fields Act wasn't publicly rejected. It was stalled by polite nods with no commitments, by procedural reviews, by closed-door sessions that conveniently excluded Cassandra. The gatekeepers still sat in their usual chairs. They didn't attack her directly. They held the line, with polished language, with coffee served civilly, and with a kind of strategic inertia coded decades deep into the system. But Cassandra hadn't come to plead. She moved through the halls of the legislature not as an outsider, but as someone who once helped shape these laws, who had seen them wielded as both shield and blade. She carried a clean copy of the Fields Act. No slogans, no branding, just simple, tight language crafted like a manual for rebuilding trust. Instead of appealing to emotion, she asked a question. If one day your daughter's pulled over at night, how would you want that interaction to go? It didn't demand an answer, but it forced a moment of reflection. Because a system without transparency doesn't just harm people of color, it corrodes public trust across all communities, leaving taxpayers wondering whether they're funding their vulnerability. On the campaign trail for the bill, Cassandra received many gentle rejections. Some said, the issue is under review. Others said, the timing isn't right. She never pushed back. She simply left behind the draft, along with one line, I'll be back, and when you're ready, we'll begin again from that question. Outside, public reaction remained sharply divided. In some cities, flags supporting the Fields Act hung outside council offices. In others, police unions issued veiled threats of walkouts if the bill advanced. On conservative radio, the act was denounced as collective punishment for the missteps of a few. Cassandra didn't argue with them. She let the numbers speak. She and her team held a data briefing with a group of centrist lawmakers. 76% of unjustified traffic stops targeted people of color. Over 60% of rural police departments had never properly activated their body cams. In 5 years, only 3 officers had been disciplined for misconduct, all thanks to media investigations, not internal reporting. No one could refute the numbers. They sat there, cold on the page, but through Cassandra's voice, they took human form. Grandmothers, fathers, sons behind the wheel, choosing between speaking up or staying alive. She never tried to turn the Fields Act into a black-only symbol. She spoke of fairness as a foundation for any community hoping to endure. A system that can't be held accountable by its citizens is one destined for decay. A society where police fear oversight more than criminals is a society adrift. Under the dim yellow light of a legislator's office, the document she handed out began to stay on the table, not pushed aside. Policy aides started taking notes. Internal calendars quietly marked the Fields Act for public comment consideration, its first appearance on the official agenda. At the same time, Cassandra organized listening sessions not just in major cities, but in small towns, places that once saw her as an outsider. But this time, people came for something else. They wanted to hear not about racism, but about transparency, something eroding in their neighborhoods. In a modest hall in Plaquemine, a white woman in her 60s stood up after Cassandra's presentation and said, "I used to think this didn't concern me, but now I understand. When a system loses control over one group, it's only a matter of time before it does the same to all of us." That quote spread online like a fresh wave. And from that point on, the Fields Act was no longer just legislation. It became a symbol of what America needed most, a system of mutual accountability between its people and its power. That afternoon, the wind from Lake Pontchartrain swept through the long corridors of Cedar Creek Academy, billowing the white curtains in the second-floor classrooms. The school, nestled on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, stood with its clean campus, ancient oaks shading the walkways, and cold gray stone walls that still carried the quiet conservatism of generations past. It was here, nearly 2 years earlier, that Cassandra had received a rejection letter for a teaching position, not due to lack of qualifications, but because her demeanor did not align with the traditional image of the community. They had never mentioned race, but she had understood perfectly. And yet today, she returned to the school not as an applicant, but as an honored guest speaker, after the Fields Act passed in the Louisiana State House with majority support. The vote hadn't come with roaring applause, but it sent tremors through towns, headlines, and civics classrooms. It was a declaration, written in patience, courage, and clarity, that justice is not a privilege, but a structural necessity in any democracy that hopes to endure. Cedar Creek Academy received Cassandra with a mix of curiosity and cautious respect, but when she stepped onto the old wooden stage, in front of over 200 students, faculty, and guests, the room rose to its feet, not as a formality, but as an instinctive gesture for the woman who had once been dismissed but never turned away. Cassandra placed her hand on the podium. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang steady, deep, and clear, like a drumbeat from the center of the earth. She didn't recount political victories, nor did she dwell on the attacks, the threats, or the quiet years of advocacy. She spoke of lives ruined by a system lacking transparency, of those who never stood before a court because their voices were never recorded. On the first night, she installed a hidden microphone beneath her car seat, not to protect herself, but to preserve the truth for a day when no one else would be willing to face it. A white boy, about 15, with pale blonde hair, stood and raised his hand. His voice didn't shake, but his gaze reached everyone in the room. "Ms. Cassandra," he asked, "how do I make sure I don't become another Clay Hensley?" The room fell still. A single breath seemed suspended in the air. Cassandra nodded gently. She stepped down from the podium, approached the boy, and looked him in the eyes, as if she were speaking to an entire generation. "By learning to ask questions instead of making assumptions," she said, "because true strength doesn't use force to dominate, it uses understanding to uphold fairness." Her answer was short, but it moved like a quiet fire. In a room where trust had once been fractured by invisible prejudice, new seeds were being planted. After the talk, a group of students approached Cassandra, asking permission to form a local policy watchdog club where they wanted to learn about civil rights, transparency, and how laws are made. An Indian American girl said, "I never thought law was a place for someone like me, but today I want to try." A history teacher walked Cassandra to her car, pausing before opening the door. "I used to wonder why you fought so hard. Now I see it wasn't for victory, it was for the future of these kids." Outside Cedar Creek Academy, a light rain began to fall. Cassandra didn't rush. She unlocked her phone, scrolling through the day's news. A police department in Rapides Parish had just released its first ever racial breakdown of traffic stops. A group of law students launched Free Fields Act workshops in underserved communities. A small local paper ran the headline, "New Law, New Trust." None of it was loud, but each word was proof of something undeniable. Real change doesn't start from the top of power. It begins when ordinary people sit down together, speak with respect, and correct course with responsibility. Cassandra looked out at the oaks swaying in the wind. This country still had cracks, but from those cracks, light could enter. The new badge was pinned to Logan's chest on a spring morning. Inside a modest meeting room at the parish police headquarters, there were no elaborate ceremonies, no formal music, just the steady gaze of Lieutenant Marlene Keaton and a clear, measured announcement. Sergeant Logan Price, assigned to the Special Community Development Program. She didn't add a string of titles, because what Logan was about to do couldn't be contained in any bureaucratic label. Just a few months after the Fields Act passed, the conversation about justice and civil rights no longer lived only in legislative chambers. It reached deeper into churches, schools, town halls, and the wooden benches where neighbors gathered every weekend. Amid those conversations, an idea quietly took shape, sparked by Keaton herself. If justice was designed to serve the people, then education about justice must begin at the roots, with the children. Logan didn't hesitate. He understood in silence this was the road that needed walking, not to change everything in a day, but to replant trust where it had once been severed in the earliest civics classes. That's how Justice Starts Young was born, not as a PR campaign, but a quiet reconstruction. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Logan wore his uniform but carried no weapon. He drove a civilian car to local schools, sat beside principals and teachers, and spoke about the right to be heard, about how to ask a police officer, "Am I being detained?" with confidence instead of fear. He told stories once avoided, not to provoke distrust, but to awaken awareness. In a high school classroom in Ruston, he asked, "Who here has ever felt like they couldn't speak up when something wasn't fair?" 2/3 of the students raised their hands. Among them were kids with curly hair and brown skin, but also blonde-haired, white-skinned teens from deeply conservative families. Their hands didn't rise the same way, but the feeling of being silenced was universal. Logan hadn't come to assign blame. He came to teach people to look directly. Together with Keaton, they developed workshops simulating scenarios, being pulled over, having an officer knock at your door, witnessing a friend being questioned without cause. They taught students how to remember details, how to activate their phone cameras legally, and how to keep their tone calm without backing down. To the students, these were life skills. To Keaton and Logan, they were the foundations of a society that protects itself through knowledge. One afternoon at Mount Olive Church, as Logan was speaking with parents about the Fields Act and civil rights, a middle-aged man stood up, a veteran, once stationed in Fallujah. "Do you believe what you're doing will change anything?" he asked. His voice wasn't hostile, but it was heavy. Logan stepped down from the podium. He didn't answer immediately. Then, he held up his phone and played a clip from another workshop, a 12-year-old black girl standing tall and saying, "I don't want to grow up afraid. I want to ask a cop, are you here to protect me or to check me?" "I believe," Logan said softly, "because she believes." The man nodded. He didn't say more, but after that evening he started accompanying his daughter to community classes. The Justice Starts Young program eventually expanded to 13 parishes. Fields Act brochures were stocked at libraries, places where no one used to browse legal documents. Teen groups began writing letters to town councils, inquiring about traffic stop data, complaint reports, and the pace of reform. Some teachers called it premature dissent. Logan didn't argue. He simply said, "That's the sign of a democracy learning how to grow." Cassandra followed the program's progress. Though she rarely appeared in person, she sent printed material, handwritten notes to students, encouraging them to listen, to understand, and to challenge with patience. In a letter to Logan, she wrote, "This is a revolution bullets cannot stop, because it begins with language, with eye contact, with the questions that sound most innocent." Not everyone welcomed the program. Some police departments refused to let officers participate. A few workshop reports mysteriously disappeared. Logan was called a traitor to the badge by a group of retired officers. Still, he showed up. Still, he taught. Still, he took notes, not to retaliate but to refine, because he knew trust is broken by violence, but is only rebuilt through education and consistency. At the end of the program's first year, a Haitian student wrote in her journal, "For the first time, I realized that police have to keep learning too, and I want to help teach them by doing it right, starting now." Keaton read that line and laughed quietly, a sound light as wind over fields after rain. She looked at Logan and said softly, "This is what's worth living for." In her voice there was no naive optimism, only a truth that could no longer be denied. If justice had once been a fence to keep people out, the next generation would turn it into a bridge. And by then, they wouldn't just know the Fields Act as the name of a law. They would remember it as the name of a woman who stepped out of silence to begin a voice that would echo for generations. Not every storm begins with thunder. Sometimes change comes like a sigh in a government hallway, like the slow creak of a door that had always been shut suddenly cracking open, revealing that what lies inside is no longer the same. Over a year after the Fields Act was passed, small nameplates began appearing on the front doors of civilian oversight boards across 14 parishes. Not flashy, not loud, but each sign was a quiet vow from a system once sturdy and blind. Every town, every city had its beginning. In Lafayette, a team of law students began cross-checking reports from local police departments. In St. Landry, a group of pastors volunteered to attend hearings as community observers. And in Jackson, an aging judge, once known for avoiding conflict, handed down a ruling that left the courtroom frozen in silence. It was a gray Monday morning. Wind curled around the stone rooftops of the federal courthouse. The room wasn't crowded, but the air was thick with the kind of tension only those who had watched the system for decades could sense. The plaintiff was a young black man arrested during a routine traffic stop. Officers said he was acting suspicious, searched his car, and found a box cutter under the passenger seat. No one was harmed. No threats were made. But the police statement painted him as a threat. The officer insisted he had followed protocol. But when the prosecutor requested body cam footage, the answer was simple. The device wasn't working that day. The judge asked no further questions. He simply opened the printed Fields Act and tapped the wooden bench. Body cams are not a suggestion. They are a condition for preserving truth. No footage, no audio, no independent record. Then the testimony cannot serve as a foundation for conviction. He didn't raise his voice, but each word scraped against the old habits of institutional leniency. The charges were dropped. In the tense silence, the young man walked out from the defendant's seat, hands still shaken, but back straight. He didn't leave the courthouse with a sense of triumph, but with the feeling that, for the first time, he stood under the same law as everyone else. Word of the ruling spread faster than expected, not through the press, but through the tremor it caused within the ranks. Officers who had once viewed body cams as nuisances now had to relearn how to conduct themselves. Captains who ignored malfunction reports were now required to sign off on every equipment audit. The silence was broken not by shouting, but by the steady rhythm of justice knocking on the table. Cassandra watched from a distance. She didn't need to be present. She knew, the moment a law is cited not as a theory but as a non-negotiable truth, her journey had entered a new phase. No longer about proven necessity, but witnessing the spread of transformation. Logan received reports from nearby parishes. He saw change not just in numbers, but in stories shared during Justice Start's young classes. A boy said that the previous week, his father had been pulled over, and the officer had said, "First, we're recording this entire stop. You have the right to review it afterward." The father took out his wallet with steady hands. Marlene Keaton, now stationed in a regional coordination office, received letters from the civilian oversight boards. They included thank yous from single mothers, youth organizations, and even from an Italian-American retired officer who once opposed the Fields Act. "I thought I was being stripped of authority. Now I see I've been freed from the things that kept me from looking my community in the eye." One weekend afternoon, at the Bogalusa Community Center, Cassandra sat in the back row, quietly watching a sixth-grade girl stand before a whiteboard and explain to her class the right to ask why they're being stopped. The girl wore a faded t-shirt, her hair braided into two simple plaits, but her eyes were bright. "I know the law protects me," she said, "not because I'm special, but because I'm part of America." Cassandra looked out the window. It wasn't summer yet, but the air had changed. Every room she now walked into carried a different temperature. Not the chill of suspicion, but the fragile warmth of expectation. A year ago, every word she said was questioned. Now, people began to listen, not because she shouted louder, but because the law had taken shape, and she knew deeply. One law could not heal everything, but it could be the first candle, enough to light the way for those no longer willing to walk in the dark. Many thought Cassandra Fields would stop after the Fields Act. They called her a hero, wrote about her in the press, framed her portrait in long TV specials, wrapped in applause and inspirational background music. Some even said she deserved a break, a ceremonial seat, a plaque, a few commemorative dinners. But she knew. Icons are often placed on pedestals so they no longer have to keep moving. Cassandra had never asked to be celebrated. She only wanted to keep working because too much remained unfinished. When the media dust settled, she returned to where she belonged. Small classrooms, low-ceilinged halls, and the hands still trembling as they held a legal document for the first time. She went to community colleges where students balanced school with shifts. She visited churches, speaking with youth groups after Sunday services about civil rights, about what it means to say, "I know the law" during a late-night traffic stop. She showed up in Intro to Politics classes not as a lecturer, but as a storyteller. She taught through her gaze, through her breath, through knowing when to pause just long enough for students to fill in the silence with their thinking. She didn't hand out answers. She sparked questions. At a round table in Franklin High School, when a student asked, "How do you know when to speak up?" Cassandra smiled, pulled out a small card, and handed it over. It read only one sentence: "When silence starts costing you sleep." People saw her at policy advisory boards, always seated in the back row, never the first to grab the mic. But when she did speak, the room shifted. not because of volume, but because of depth. Every word she chose sounded like it had been sanded down by years of watching people, systems, and how both collided in every single decision. Cassandra never claimed the law could fix everything, but she believed this. If people don't understand the law, they will always be controlled by someone who does, and sometimes that person won't be trying to protect them. She wrote short essays, published both in academic journals and small-town newspapers, not to argue theory, but to preserve memory. She recounted the Clay Hensley trial not as a judgment, but as a collective lesson in vigilance. She described Logan Price not as a war hero, but as proof that courage doesn't begin with fire. It begins with the choice between silence and what's right. Cassandra never built monuments, but she quietly laid the first stones so a new generation might build their own. And later, when people ask, "What made you keep going?" her answer never changed. Because the classroom still has students, and the world still needs explanation. True change, she always emphasized, doesn't begin in a legislative chamber. It begins in a glance that dares to question, a hand that dares to raise, and a heart that refuses to turn away. The story of Cassandra Fields didn't begin with a medal, nor did it end with a glowing headline. It began with a skeptical glance, and continued with thousands of steady steps that led a generation out of the shadows of fear. Cassandra never waited for the world to be perfect before she acted. She began in a small classroom with quiet conversations, and with every moment she explained a law to a child who never believed that the law was meant for them too. She didn't keep walking for fame. She walked on because she knew, if she stopped, those following her might lose their way. And what about you? When you see something wrong, will you stay silent or step forward and help redraw the road, as Cassandra once did? If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to help us amplify these journeys. Stories that stir the heart and awaken the responsibility we all carry.